Eno Farihah was born on October 6, 1997, in the small Indonesian neighborhood known as Kampung Bangkir. She was the third of 7 children born to parents Arif Fikri and Maputo. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they raised their children in a community that valued faith and hard work. Those who knew her described her as a well-liked young woman with a warm smile. By all accounts, she was a good kid from a decent family who wanted better for herself and the people she loved. At the time of our story, Eno was 18 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her.
By 2016, Indonesia had a booming manufacturing sector concentrated in the suburbs and satellite cities surrounding Jakarta, places like Tangerang, which were largely industrial. For many young people, traveling there for factory work meant independence and a way to send money home. Eno was one of those young people. By the time she was a teenager, she had made the journey to Kosambi, a district within the Tangerang Regency, where she took a job as a factory worker at PT Palita Global Mandiri, a plastics manufacturing company. Like many of her fellow workers, Eno lived in the factory's employee dorms right there on the company's grounds. For Eno, who was hours away from her family, the factory dorms were home. Among her closest friends at the factory were 3 women who would later become central to the story of what happened to her. Their names were Fitro, Ero, and Novi. They were essentially Eno's work family. They all walked to work together and often spent their lunches together. Eno also had a boyfriend named Rahmat Alim, and the two had only been together for about a month at the time of the events of today's story. Their relationship was not recognized or approved by Eno's parents, and there was a reason for that. Rahmat Alim was not a fellow factory worker. He was a 15-year-old junior high school student. The age gap and the disapproval from her family would be woven into a web of jealousy and rage that would violently end Eno's life on the night of May 12th into the early hours of May 13th, 2016. The National Commission on Violence Against Women, known as Komnas Perempuan, had documented hundreds of thousands of cases of violence against women every year. In 2014 alone, they recorded 293,220 such cases, with 68% of these being family violence. Women factory workers were among the most at risk, and there were reasons for this. A big one being that factory dorms were often minimally secured, and young women living far from home had few options or support systems if something went wrong.
There were 3 perpetrators. The first was 15-year-old Rahmat Alim. He was, as mentioned, Eno's boyfriend. According to investigators, Rahmat Alim had learned that Eno's parents had arranged a marriage for her with another man, following her family's wishes. Rahmat was reportedly aware that Eno had accepted this plan, agreeing to end things with him. According to some accounts, Rahmat Alim had gone to Eno's dorm that night. He wanted, at least, one last meeting and farewell. Other reports suggested he wanted more than that. He wanted a kiss, and when they were alone together, he pushed for intimacy. Eno refused him. The second perpetrator was 24-year-old Rahmat Arifin, who was another resident of the dorm complex. He and Rahmat Alim had run into each other that night, and according to reports, Rahmat Arifin himself had developed feelings for Eno and had been rejected by her. The third perpetrator was 24-year-old Imam Hapriyadi. He was, like Rahmat Arifin, also at the dorm complex. He also reportedly had some connection to Eno, described in some accounts as an admirer who had been rejected. Indonesian news agencies reported that all 3 men were heartbroken by Eno for different reasons, and that they only planned the rape and murder after the 3 met each other and realized that Eno had hurt them. Now, think about what that means for a moment. 3 men, each with a grudge against one woman. A woman who had done nothing but say no. They found each other that night and compared notes and decided to do something about it.
It was raining that night. The dorm was largely empty. Most residents were elsewhere that night. The rain muffled whatever sounds came from inside. Sadly, no one would hear Eno, and no one would come to save her. What we are about to describe is very graphic. We don't usually take the time to say this, but it was one of the most brutal crimes ever to be covered in the Indonesian national media. We want to be straightforward with you about that before we go further. We are going to follow the investigative timeline and the medical examiner's findings as carefully and accurately as possible because Eno deserves to have her story told truthfully in full without softening the reality of what was done to her. On the evening of May 12th, 2016, Rahmat Aleem had come to see Eno. The two spoke for approximately 30 minutes. At some point in that conversation, Rahmat Aleem made a pass and Eno refused him. Her reasons, according to investigators, was that she was afraid of becoming pregnant, an entirely reasonable refusal. Rahmat, furious, left the room, but he didn't go home. He found Rahmat Arifin. As the two of them were talking, Iman Haprati appeared. According to the investigative reconstruction of events, Rahmat Aleem told the other two men that he had gone there to see Eno. What emerged from that conversation was not recorded in full. We don't exactly know what was spoken between them, but we do know what they ended up deciding to do.
The three men went into Eno's room. When they entered, Eno was asleep on her bed wearing only her underwear. Imam Hapriyati immediately pressed a pillow over her face, smothering her. He told Rahmat Aleem to go to the kitchen and find a knife. Rahmat Aleem could not find one, so he went looking outside the room for something else. While he was gone, Rahmat Arifin violently essayed Eno while Imam Hapriyati held her down and kept smothering her. Then, Rahmat Aleem returned to the room. He had a gardening hoe known as a cankle with him. Imam directed Rahmat Arifin to strike Eno across the face and neck with the tool. The blows opened wounds across her cheek and jaw. Eno was still alive, still breathing, but was extremely injured. According to reports, Rahmat Aleem was disturbed by the blood. He briefly left the room again because he was disgusted by the sight of it. He returned a short time later to check on whether Eno was still alive. What happened next is how the case got its name, Eno Cankle, or Eno of the Hoe. Rahmat Arifin inserted the handle of the hoe inside of Eno's body. He forced it upward, and one of the perpetrators kicked the blade end as hard as he could, driving the handle further into her body. It pierced her womb and continued through her pelvis into her abdominal cavity. According to police statements and the subsequent CT scan evidence, the handle traveled approximately 60 centimeters upward through her body. The handle reached as high as Eno's fifth rib, and she died from her injuries. After confirming she was dead, the three men went through her belongings and Rahmat Aleem stole her cell phone. They each went into the bathroom and washed Eno's blood from their hands and bodies. Then, they pulled clothes and other items from her closet and piled everything on top of her body, trying to hide the body and buy themselves time before the smell gave them away. They left the room, locked the door from the outside, and threw the room key back inside through an air vent near the door.
When Eno did not show up for work, Fitro, Arrow, and Novi all tried to call her. After she didn't answer, they went to her room, which was locked from the outside. They knocked and yelled, but were met with silence. With little other option, they were able to get one of their male coworkers to help break down the door. Eno's room was in utter chaos, with clothes and other items piled on the bed. And beneath the heap was Eno's leg, sticking out from under the pile of fabric that had been placed over her body to hide what had been done. They found Eno naked, covered in blood, the garden hose still inside her. Her body was transported to Tangerang District Hospital, where a full autopsy was conducted on May 14th. External injuries included cuts and abrasions on her right cheek and neck, as well as bruising to both her upper and lower lip. Some of the most damning injuries were bite marks on her breasts that were confirmed through forensic analysis to belong to Rahmat Aleem. His DNA was recovered from her body, and his fingerprints were found in the room. There were fractures to Eno's right cheekbone and the right jaw. There was an open wound that penetrated the lining of the pelvic cavity. Internally, her liver had been lacerated so severely that the wound extended through to the right chest cavity. Her right lung had been ruptured as a result. There was also evidence of hemorrhaging in her chest and abdominal cavity. The CT scan showed that the hoe handle had traveled all the way to the level of the 5th rib on the right side of her chest. Police Director Krishnamurti was clear that in his many years working homicide cases, this was the most sadistic crime he had ever seen. Police tracked the suspects through Eno's stolen cell phone, which led them straight to Ramat Aleem. All 3 suspects were arrested on May 14th, the day after Eno's body was discovered. On top of everything else, investigators also found blood evidence in their homes. The case against the 3 men was overwhelming.
All 3 men were charged and brought before the Tangerang District Court. The prosecutors charged them under Indonesian Criminal Code, specifically Article 340 for premeditated murder and Article 285 for SA. Because Ramat Aleem was a minor, his case was heard separately in a closed juvenile court proceeding. The defense tried to argue that their client did not know the victim and had purchased her phone from a third party named Dimas. Prosecutors dismissed this, noting that Dimas had never been introduced during any prior proceeding. In June of 2016, just about a month after Eno's murder, that proceeding concluded and Ramat Aleem was convicted. Under Indonesian law, the maximum sentence for a juvenile offender is half that of the adult maximum. He was sentenced to just 10 years in prison, which is the maximum allowable under juvenile law. Eno's family and friends were devastated by that sentence. 10 years. For the boy who brought the hoe and helped plan the whole murder and then cover it up in the most disgusting way you could possibly kill someone you're supposed to care about. Now, hundreds of people swarmed the courthouse in fury. They felt justice wasn't served, which it wasn't, and they wanted to drag Ramat Aleem through the streets. Police rushed to protect the building as rocks were thrown at the courthouse. Police formed a human shield and rushed him and his lawyer out of the building through a back exit, protecting them from the crowd. The rage was real, and the grief was real.
The proceedings for Ramat Arifin and Imam Hapriyadi were held publicly at the Tangerang District Court. 7 witnesses testified and forensic evidence was presented. Both adult defendants were stone-faced for most of the trial. February 8th, 2017, the panel of judges at the Tangerang District Court unanimously decided on their punishment: death. Panel chair judge Mohammed Irfan Siragar read the verdict. The court cited their sadistic and vile conduct, the profound trauma caused to the victim's family, their refusal to admit guilt, and their complete absence of remorse. The judge added that there was no world in which any other punishment could be justified. According to reports, both defendants appeared calm and showed no emotion as their sentences were read. Their defense counsel filed an appeal, but their sentences were upheld. As of the date of this recording in April of 2026, both Ramat Arifin and Imam Hapriyadi remain on death row awaiting execution. Ramat Aleem, having been sentenced as a juvenile, would have been eligible for release this year depending on remission credits under Indonesian law. And unfortunately, we don't have any information to confirm or deny if Ramat Aleem is behind bars.
Eno's case became one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in Indonesian media history, covered by every major outlet, and was all over social media. Eno's gruesome murder generated further intense national debate about women's safety, as her killing was one of the most sadistic murder cases in Indonesia. Her case landed at a moment where women's rights were already front and center in Indonesia. Just weeks prior, the country had been rocked by the essay and murder of Yuyun, a 14-year-old girl in the Bengkulu province of Sumatra who, on April 2, 2016, was attacked by 14 men and boys on her way home from school. She was described as a bright student who was ranked 3rd in her class. Her body was later dumped at a rubber plantation. Women's rights activists and members of the public took to the streets demanding accountability. President Joko Widodo had been calling for legislative action to tighten convictions for these types of crimes against women. He later made the following tweet, referring to Yuyun using her initials. He said, "We all mourn the tragic departure of YY. Arrest and punish the perpetrators as severely as possible. Women and children have to be protected from violence." According to Kate Walton, a Jakarta-based women's rights activist, Yuyeon was actually just one of 44 women and girls killed by men and boys in the first 4 months of 2016, but her case was certainly one of the most brutal. Eno's murder added to that pressure. Advocates and organizations used it to push for what eventually would become the Elimination of Sexual Violence Bill. The bill was introduced in 2016 in response to the wave of cases that year by the National Commission on Violence Against Women, or Komnas Perempuan, and partner organizations. That bill, however, would face years of obstruction from political factions within the Indonesian parliament. It was officially dropped as a legislative priority in 2020 before eventually being revived. It was not until 6 years after Eno's murder that Indonesia finally enacted a comprehensive law addressing sexual violence. The struggle to pass that law was shaped by victims like Eno.
Eno's story sparked conversation about workplace safety for women in factories. Young women in factory dorms far from home in minimally secured housing were easy targets. Factory owners were pushed to look at how they were housing their female workers and what measures they were taking to ensure their safety. After Eno's murder had become public, the women who had lived in Eno's dorm simply could not stay. One by one, they left. The dorm emptied out almost completely after Eno's murder. The women said they couldn't shake the thought about what their neighbor had gone through in her room that night. There is one more thing about the aftermath of this case that must be addressed, as uncomfortable as it is, and that's the internet's response to her murder. Because of the specific, unusual nature of the weapon used in Eno's murder, as we mentioned previously, her case was nicknamed Eno Kenggol, with Kenggol being the Indonesian word for garden hoe. And on social media, particularly from users in neighboring Malaysia, the case was made into a meme. This is very hard to comprehend, as we don't often see random people making fun of murder victims, especially one who died in such a brutal and heinous way. People photograph themselves lying on garden hose, mimicking Eno's death for laughs. It sadly wasn't just a couple of people either. Some framed it as a commentary on women who violate religious norms, saying that Eno got what she deserved for how she lived her life in their eyes. Others said that they were just doing it to be edgy. Either way, Eno's death, one of the most vile and disgusting murders that we have ever covered on this channel, was turned into a punchline. People celebrated and mocked it. I don't even know how to finish this thought because it feels like me condemning this is not enough. This is one of 2 times we've seen this happen, the other being Heaven Awat, which was also insanely violent, and I am dumbfounded and sickened that any grown adult would mock or celebrate any murder such as theirs.
Eno Farihah was buried in Lebak Wangi, just a short distance from the village where she was born. A YouTube video whose title translates to "Dozens of her co-workers weep at Eno Farihah's grave" documented this scene at the cemetery. The title says it all. The women she had worked beside, ate lunch with, and walked to the factory with, they came to bury her. They wept at her graveside. These were the same women who would soon pack up their belongings and leave the dorm they could no longer bear to live in, the dorm where their friend had died. On May 19, 2016, 1 week after Eno's death, Indonesia's Minister of Social Affairs, Kofifa Indar Parawangsa, traveled to Kampong Bangkir to visit Eno's family personally. The minister attended a 7-day Islamic prayer ceremony that the family had organized, the Tujuh Hari, a traditional commemoration held 7 days after a death. She also visited Eno's grave at the local cemetery to offer her respect and prayers. The minister's visit was significant. A cabinet-level official traveling to a rural village within a week of a murder tells you something about how much pressure was on the government to respond and do something here. But Eno deserved so much more. She deserved to grow old. It's now the 10-year anniversary of her murder. She deserved the ordinary life she was working so hard to build. And that was a paycheck, some independence, and a future her parents back at the compound would have been proud of.